You found something recently. Maybe it was a photograph. Maybe it was a text conversation from a few years ago, or a journal entry, or a voicemail you forgot to delete. Maybe it was just a memory that arrived without warning, the way memories do, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, and you stopped what you were doing because something in it felt like encountering a stranger. That person in the photo, that voice in the voicemail, the one who wrote those words in that journal. You recognize them, but you are not them anymore. And somewhere underneath the recognition, a feeling you might not have named yet. Not grief exactly, not relief exactly. Something that contains both. The person you used to be believed certain things that you no longer believe, wanted certain things that no longer pull at you, was afraid of things that no longer frighten you, and was not afraid of things that frighten you now. You have changed. You are still changing. And for many people, in the quiet hours before sleep, this is one of the most unsettling truths of being alive. Not that things outside you change, that you change, that the self you have been carrying as a fixed point of reference has been moving all along, without your permission, without announcement, without waiting for you to decide whether you were ready. Before we begin, leave one word in the comments tonight. One word for what it feels like to have changed without choosing to. Different, lost, free, older, unrecognizable. Whatever is most honest, someone will read it and understand without needing any further explanation. If this channel is finding you something worth returning to, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. Now, let your eyes close if they are ready. Tonight we move between two worlds. The first is the one you know. A woman in Portland who has not been able to explain to her oldest friend why they no longer have anything to say to each other. A man in Atlanta who keeps returning to his hometown and finding it smaller each time, until he realizes that what has become smaller is not the town. A woman in Chicago who reads her own diary from 8 years ago and does not recognize the person who wrote it. A man in Seattle who cannot remember when he stopped being afraid of the things he used to be afraid of, or when the new fears arrived. The second world is older. Stories from 6 traditions and 10 centuries. A Chinese monk of the Tang period who spent 30 years trying to preserve a version of himself that had already become something else. A Japanese woman of the Heian court who understood, in the middle of the night, that the person her husband had fallen in love with no longer existed, and had not existed for some time. A Tibetan teacher who was asked by a student why he seemed different from his younger self, and gave an answer that has been carried in the tradition for 700 years. A Korean merchant who returned to his childhood home and understood for the first time what home actually means. A Burmese nun who spent 20 years becoming someone she had not planned to become, and found, in the unplanned becoming, something more real than the plan. And a very old Vietnamese woman who told her daughter, on the last night of her life, that she had been at least 4 completely different people across her 87 years, and that each one had been entirely herself. These stories are contemplative in nature, offered for rest and reflection, not as medical or therapeutic advice. Feel the specific weight of the body you are in tonight. Not the body you were in 5 years ago. Not the body you imagine you should be in. This one, as it is, carrying everything it carries, changed in the ways it has changed, still breathing, still here. The stories are waiting. Sarah had been friends with Megan since the 7th grade, 22 years, through high school and different colleges, and the period in their mid-20s when they lived in different cities, and called each other every Sunday. Through Megan's divorce and Sarah's job loss, and the years when they were each other's primary reference point for who they were and what their life meant. They still texted. They still met for coffee when Megan came through Portland. which happened 2 or 3 times a year. And every time they met, the coffee lasted exactly as long as the coffee lasted, which was not long, and then they said they should do this more often, and meant it, and then they didn't. Sarah had been trying to understand this for 2 years. She had not become cruel. She had not become indifferent to Megan's life. She still felt warmth when Megan's name appeared on her phone. But the warmth had a quality that she could not name, a quality like looking at a photograph of a place you once loved and finding it beautiful without wanting to go back. Lying in bed one night, she finally found the word. She had changed. Not away from Megan exactly, into someone that the version of herself who had needed Megan so completely no longer was. The friendship had been built between two people who had both become different people. The friendship remained. The people it had been built between were gone. This was not a failure. It was not a betrayal. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it felt like loss because it was loss, and it felt like relief because it was relief, and it felt like grief because it was grief, and underneath all of it was something she recognized on that late night in Portland as the truth. You cannot hold a river in place, and you cannot hold a person in place either, including yourself. In the mountains of Shaanxi province during the Tang dynasty, in the 8th century, there was a monk named Gikan, not the hermit of the vine story, but a different practitioner, a calligrapher and poet who had entered the monastery at 24 and had spent 30 years developing a self he considered his true self. The self was specific, rigorous, devoted to practice in a particular way, organized around certain teachings, certain methods, certain qualities of attention he had cultivated with great care across 3 decades. He was 54 years old when a young monk came to him and asked him to explain something he had written when he was 28. A piece of calligraphy, a poem, that had been preserved in the monastery's collection and that the young monk considered among the finest examples of his master's work. Gikan read the piece. He did not recognize it, not in the sense of having forgotten it. He remembered writing it. He could see, in the brushwork, the specific quality of his attention at 28, the particular eagerness of someone who has recently understood something and is trying to render that understanding in a form that will last. He did not recognize the person who had written it. The understanding that had produced the poem was still present in him, but transformed, the way a river is still the same river even when the water is entirely different water. The 28-year-old who had written the poem was gone. What remained was something that had grown from him, the way a tree grows from a seed, without being the seed. The young monk asked, "Which version of you wrote better?" Gikan sat with this for a long time. Then he said, "The one who wrote that piece was complete for that moment. The one sitting here now is complete for this one." The question of which is better assumes there is a fixed standard to measure against, but the standard also changes. That is the nature of the practice. That is the nature of the person practicing. He paused. If you are looking for the version of yourself that will finally be the right version, you will be looking your entire life. Each version is the right version for the conditions that produced it, and the conditions are always changing. The young monk asked, "Then what remains?" Gikan looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "The one who is always in the middle of becoming. That is what remains. That is what you are." Sarah, lying in her apartment in Portland, had no access to this teaching, but she was, that night, in the middle of the same understanding. The friendship with Megan was not broken. It had become something that could only exist between the people they were now, which was quieter and more occasional, and contained within it the weight of 22 years without requiring the frequency of 22 years ago. It had changed because they had changed, and they had changed because that is what people do. And that is not a loss of the people they were, it is the continuation of them into the people they are. Let the breath be the length of the breath. Feel the specific quality of the person you are tonight, not the person you were 5 years ago, not the person you will be in 5 more. This one, in the middle of becoming. And as Gikan sits with the young monk in the Tang monastery, and the calligraphy rests between them, we travel now to Japan, where a woman in the Heian court understood in the middle of the night that the person her husband had loved no longer existed. Marcus drove back to Macon every Thanksgiving. He had grown up there. His mother still lived in the same house, the same yellow house on the same street, and the drive from Atlanta took just under 2 hours, and he had made it every year for 31 years since he left for college at 17. The house was the same. His mother was older but the same. The neighborhood had changed in specific ways that made it different but recognizable. What had happened to Macon was not something Marcus could point to. It had gotten smaller, not geographically, not in population. It had gotten smaller in the way that places get smaller when you have grown larger than them, when the place that once contained your entire world now contains only a portion of it, and the portion that remains is real and dear and somehow no longer the size it used to be. He sat on his mother's porch on Thanksgiving evening, after the meal, in the specific quiet of a Georgia evening in November, and he understood something he had been circling for several years. Macon had not changed. He had. The smallness was not in the town. It was in the distance between who he had been when Macon was his whole world and who he was now, for whom Macon was one beloved piece of a larger world. The town had stayed the same. The person for whom it had once been everything had grown into someone for whom it was something, not less, different. He sat on the porch for a long time after that, looking at the street he had ridden his bicycle down 1,000 times, feeling something he could not fully name, which was the specific feeling of loving something completely, while understanding that you are no longer the person who needed it the way you once needed it. In the imperial court of Kyoto during the Heian period, in the late 10th century, there was a court lady named Tsultrim Palmo, not the Tibetan woman of the passes, but a Japanese woman given an unusual name by a mother who had heard it from a traveling monk and found it beautiful. A woman who had been married for 11 years to a man who loved her with the specific intensity of someone who has found, in another person, the resolution of a long loneliness. She was 33 years old. Her husband loved her. This was clear and genuine and had not diminished. What had happened was harder to name. She had changed. Not away from him, not toward someone else. Into someone whose interior landscape was different from the landscape of the woman he had married at 22. She had read more, suffered more, understood things she had not understood, let go of things she had once held, become quieter in ways that were not sadness. Her husband still loved her, but she understood, lying awake one night while he slept, that he loved a version of her that had been real and that she had genuine warmth for, the way one has warmth for a younger version of oneself. But that was no longer the full truth of who she was. She had not told him this. She was not sure it could be told. She was not sure what it meant about the marriage, which was good, which she valued, which she had no intention of leaving. She lay in the dark and held the understanding, without knowing what to do with it. The following morning she went to a teacher at the small temple attached to the court's garden. She told the teacher what she had been lying with. The teacher was an old nun who had been practicing for 50 years. She listened without interrupting. When Tsultrim Palmo finished, the nun asked, "What do you think your husband fell in love with?" She said, "Me, the person I was." The nun said, "Is that person gone?" She thought carefully. She said, "She is somewhere in me, but she is not all of me anymore." The nun said, "This is true of everyone who loves for long enough. We are not the same person we were when we were first loved. The ones who stay beside us across years are not loving who we were. They are loving the river, which is always changing and always the same river." She paused. "The question is not whether you have changed. You have. The question is whether you will let him love the river rather than the photograph. Those are different things. The river is available. The photograph is finished." Sultrimpalmo returned to her husband that evening. She did not explain what the teacher had said. She simply sat beside him with the understanding present in her, and allowed him to love whoever she was tonight, which was different from who she had been, and which was, as far as she could tell, more fully herself. The relationship continued for many more years, not because nothing changed, because both of them, in their different ways, learned to love the river. If you have been afraid that the person someone loves is no longer exactly who you are, you may be right. You have changed. The love that was built between specific people is now being offered to someone who has grown from those people. The river is still here. Different water. The same river. Let the jaw release now. All the way. Let the face be completely soft. The river is moving. That is not a problem. That is what rivers do. And as Sultrimpalmo sits beside her husband in the Heian evening, with the new understanding quiet in her, we travel westward to the high plateau of Tibet, where a teacher was asked why he seemed different from his younger self. Diane found her diary from 2016 while packing boxes to move apartments. She had not read it in 8 years. She sat on the floor of the nearly empty apartment in Chicago with the box half packed around her and read for 2 hours. The woman who had written those entries was in pain that Diane now recognized as the specific pain of someone who does not yet know that the situation she is in will eventually end. She was afraid of things that Diane had stopped being afraid of. She wanted things Diane no longer wanted. She believed things that Diane no longer believed. She was also, in places, startlingly herself. A turn of phrase that was unmistakably Diane's. An observation about a Tuesday afternoon that Diane could have written today. The sense of humor. The particular way of seeing things that had been present at 29 and was still present at 37. Diane sat with the diary for a long time after she finished reading. She felt something she could not immediately name. It was not grief, though it contained grief. It was not pride, though it contained something like it. It was not relief, though relief was in it somewhere. It was the specific feeling of meeting someone you once were and finding them both completely familiar and completely gone. She was not that person anymore, and she would never be that person again, and the person she was now would also someday be the person she used to be. She sat in the empty apartment with this understanding until the light changed. In the Sakya monastery of central Tibet, in the late 13th century, a senior teacher named Chokyi Gyaltsen, not the monk of the meditation technique, but a different teacher of considerable age, was approached by a young student with an unusual question. The student had been given access to the monastery's archives. Among the documents he had found were teachings composed by the master when he was young, perhaps 30 years earlier. He had read them carefully. They were excellent. But they were different from the teachings the master gave now, different in ways the student could not entirely describe, as though written by someone who was related to the master, but was not quite him. He brought this observation to the teacher, carefully, not wanting to suggest that the earlier work was inferior or that the later work had lost something. The teacher listened. Then he laughed, which surprised the student. He said, "You have noticed something that most students do not notice. The teachings from 30 years ago were written by someone who understood what he understood then. The teachings I give now come from someone who understands what he understands now. These are different people. The student asked, "But which teachings are correct?" The teacher said, "Both, for the people who needed them at the time they were given." The teaching that was right for a student of 30 years ago may not be right for a student today, and the teaching that is right today may not have helped anyone 30 years ago. He paused. The Dharma is not a fixed object that one person discovers and another inherits unchanged. It is a living encounter between a teaching and a life. The teaching changes as the life changes. Both of them are true. Neither of them is final. The student asked, "Then what is the self that teaches? If you are different now from who you were, what is the continuity?" The teacher was quiet for a long time. Outside the monastery, the wind moved across the plateau with the specific sound it makes when there is nothing between you and a very large sky. He said, "The river, the water is always new. The river is always the river. What teaches is not the water that was here 30 years ago or the water that is here now. What teaches is the river, and the river is not a thing, it is a movement." He looked at the student. "You are also a river," he said. "The child you were, and the student you are, and the teacher you will become are all the same river. Different water, the same movement. The movement is what you are, not any particular water." Diane, in her empty apartment in Chicago, had no access to this teaching, but she held the diary in her lap with something close to what the student had found in the monastery. The recognition that the woman who had written those entries and the woman reading them were both her, and neither of them was the final her, and there was no final her to arrive at, only the river, still moving, always new, always the same river. She packed the diary in the box she was moving to her new apartment. She did not put it at the bottom. She put it near the top, where she could find it again. Let the body sink now, all the way, into whatever is beneath it. The water you were 8 years ago has moved on. The water you are tonight is real, and present, and new. The river is still here. And as Diane closes the box in her Chicago apartment and the evening light comes through the window of the place she is leaving, we come now to the last story. To a Vietnamese woman who was at least 4 completely different people across her 87 years. James had a specific fear he had never told anyone. He was 39, living in Seattle, working in software. By any external measure, a person who had his life organized and functioning. He exercised regularly. He had a good apartment and work he found meaningful, and friends he liked. The fear was this: he had stopped being afraid of the things that used to define him, and he did not know who he was without them. At 25, he had been afraid of failure. The fear had been a constant companion, driving him, shaping his decisions, giving his ambition its specific character. At 39, he was not afraid of failure. He had failed at enough things to understand that failure was not what he had feared it was. It was something else, something more ordinary and more survivable. The fear had not been resolved. It had simply become less relevant to the person he had become. But without it, he sometimes felt unmoored. The fear of failure had been, he understood one rainy evening in Seattle, part of how he had known who he was. Its absence did not feel like freedom. It felt like missing a landmark. He stood at his window watching the rain, and understood that he was not afraid of the same things anymore, and was not sure yet what that meant about who he was now. In a village in the Mekong Delta of southern Vietnam, in the early years of the 20th century, there was a woman named Ba Tam, not the grandmother of the love story, but a different woman of the same informal title. A woman who was, at the time of this story, 87 years old, and had been asked by her daughter to tell her what she had learned across a long life. She said, "I have been at least 4 people." Her daughter asked, "What do you mean?" She said, "There was the girl in this village before the French came, who believed certain things about the world and her place in it. Then there was the young mother during the difficult years, who believed entirely different things because the world had required it. Then there was the woman in her middle years who was building something and had a specific idea of who she was in relation to what she was building. And then there is this one, who is sitting here talking to you tonight." Her daughter asked, "Which one is the real you?" Ba Tam looked at her for a while. Then she said, "All of them. Each one was completely herself for the time she existed. None of them was final." The girl did not know she would become the young mother. The young mother did not know she would become the woman building things. And that woman did not know she would become this. She paused. What frightened me, for a long time, was the changing. Each time I became someone new, I felt like I was losing the one I had been. The girl felt like a loss when she became the mother. The mother felt like a loss when she became the builder. But now, looking back across all of them, I can see that nothing was lost. Each one was complete. Each one became the next one. The river did not lose anything by flowing. It only moved. Her daughter asked, "And this one? The one sitting here? Who will she become?" Ba Tam smiled. She said, "She will become whatever comes after sitting here talking to you. But I will not be here to see it. And I have made my peace with that, because I have learned something across 87 years that took me almost all of them to learn." Her daughter waited. Ba Tam said, "You do not have to be the same person tomorrow that you are tonight. You do not have to be the same person in 10 years that you are now. The changing is not the problem, the changing is the life. What you are is not any particular version. What you are is the river. And rivers do not mourn the water that has already flowed past." She took her daughter's hand. "Be the river," she said. "That is the only instruction that was ever worth giving." She died 3 weeks later, in her sleep, which is how rivers go when they finally reach the sea. James, at his window in Seattle, had no access to this conversation. But he stood in the rain light with a version of the same understanding beginning to arrive. The fear of failure had been a landmark, but it had been a landmark for a version of him that was no longer entirely who he was. The loss of the landmark was not the loss of the self. It was the self moving into territory that required different landmarks. He did not know yet what the new territory looked like, but he was, for the first time in a while, curious about it rather than frightened by it. That is how rivers feel when they move from one landscape into another. Curious, moving, alive. We have been in 2 worlds tonight. The world you know, where Sarah in Portland understood that friendships change because people change, and Marcus in Atlanta found his hometown had not shrunk but he had grown, and Diane in Chicago met the woman she used to be in an old diary and felt something that contained grief and pride and relief all at once. And James in Seattle stood at a rainy window and realized that losing a fear was not the same as losing himself. And the older world, where a Tang calligrapher understood that each version of himself was complete for its moment, where a Heian woman learned to let her husband love the river rather than the photograph, where a Tibetan teacher explained that what teaches is not any particular water, but the movement itself, and where a very old Vietnamese woman told her daughter to be the river, which was the only instruction that had ever been worth giving. 2 worlds, the same river. You have changed. You are not who you were 5 years ago, or 10, or 20. Some version of you has slipped past, down the river, into whatever is downstream, and what is here tonight is new water in the same river. This is not a loss. This is not a failure. This is not evidence that you have done something wrong or that something important has been misplaced. This is what alive means. The river does not mourn the water that has flowed past. It simply moves into the next landscape with the next qualities, carrying what it carries, releasing what it releases, always new, always itself. You are not who you were. You are the river that person was always part of. And the river is here, tonight, moving, alive, exactly what it is. Let the names dissolve now. Sarah, Marcus, Diane, James, Gikan, Tsultrim Palmo, the Tibetan teacher, Ba Tam. What remains is the river, breath arriving, body held. The person you are tonight, complete for this moment, already becoming the person you will be. Let it be enough to be the river. If sleep is reaching for you, let it come. The river moves even when you are not watching. It knows where it is going. Good night. Be the river. Before you go, one small thing. I made this channel for nights like this one, when the person you used to be feels more familiar than the person you are, and you need company in the in-between. If tonight gave you one moment of being at peace with having changed, I am genuinely glad. Leave one word in the comments if you feel like it. One word for who you used to be. Someone will read it and recognize themselves. And if the quiet Dharma is somewhere you want to return, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. It just means the next time a night like this one comes, this will be waiting. Good night. Be the river.